Good morning and welcome to day 17 of the Coronavirus Diaries by Geriatric 1944, otherwise known as me, Jonathan King. I'd ordered one of those face masks about 6 weeks ago when I first started feeling I was getting a bit of a bad cold or flu. It only just arrived yesterday, and I have to say it is amazing and very amusing. It's meant to be really good, far better than the ones that they officially give to doctors and nurses in hospitals. It's got 3 carbon filter on it with 2 separate holes for breathing in, and it's very tight fitting. It's got sort of all kinds of various assorted things that mean it goes right close to the nose and mouth and all the rest of it. Does make me look like a mugger, but what amused me when I got it, and I'm still spraying it with alcohol aftershave, by the way, when I got it yesterday, I looked closely at the label and it said "Made in China." I suspect Wuhan. Anyway, I've now got that, so I'm thoroughly protected, although I'm well over a month in self-isolation now. And I reckon that the whole subject of coronavirus has got really boring. In fact, it's BAB, boring as Brexit. But I suppose we're going to have to look at it still and how it's doing. I really do think it's significant that China is now relaxing all sorts of restrictions after having relatively few infections, considering how infectious I think it is, and very relatively few deaths all in the area of Wuhan. But I think it's more than that. If you look at general statistics, the amount of people who die from smoking bloody cigarettes and tobacco every year is absolutely enormous. Likewise, the amount of people that die in car accidents every year. Yet we don't see them banning cars or lorries or any kind of motor transport, do we? We don't see them banning the sale of cigarettes, which I think they ought to do, to be quite honest. Why not? Well, we know why not, because that makes a lot of money for all the governments around in taxation. I sometimes wonder about the morality and the common sense of our politicians. Anyway, yesterday I was sitting in front of my television where I tend to watch channels like Talking Pictures TV, which is brilliant, or the Sony Classic channel, which has got some great movies on. And on the Sony Classics was The Green Gage Summer, featuring Kenneth Moore, who was my next door neighbour throughout the 60s and early 70s in my little house here, where I've lived for over 55 years. He lived next door to me there. And also various other people, including a very young Jane Asher. Well, that reminded me of my days when I was a pop star in the 60s. We used to go to all the clubs, places like the Scotch of St James and the Cromwellian and the Ad Lib. And we all used to go to these clubs, all the people, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and so on. And I always used to end up on a table with Jane Asher, who was then Paul McCartney's girlfriend, and Cynthia Lennon, who was John Lennon's wife. And the reason the 3 of us were together is that all 3 of us didn't do drugs, and we also didn't drink. So we used to sit at the table sipping milk or tomato juice, looking at all our friends, all of whom were stoned out of their minds, and saying to each other, "What on earth do they think they're saying now?" It was quite an amusing time, and it lasted for several months. The 3 of us became absolutely inseparable. And that reminds me of my story that I have told in my autobiography, when I had sex with John Lennon. Now, this is another story which I wouldn't ever dream of saying if he were alive, or if I felt he would not want me to say it now. But knowing John very well, and he was a lovely guy, I was a very good friend of his, and he was a very good friend of mine, I know he wouldn't mind. One night in the Cromwellian, there was no Sin Lennon or John or Jane Asher. And John and I were together, and we got chatting up these 2 very attractive young girls, and we suggested that we all go back to my flat. At the time, I had a flat in Baker Street, so this would have been 1965. and we all went back to the flat in Baker Street, where I had no less than 4 bedrooms, because my father had had it converted, although it belonged to my mother's mother, and had it converted into a flat where fellow business people in his company, which was Tootles Shirts and Ties. They made very smart shirts and very nice looking ties, and he was managing director of that company. And they could stay overnight in this sort of like flat off Baker Street in George Street in no, I can't remember the name of the street, but it was the block was called St Andrew's Mansions, a lovely block with gorgeous old-fashioned sort of spiral metal stairs going up, and I was in flat number 20. So we went back there, and very quickly we all got together on a sort of enormous large double bed, and it became very apparent that the 2 girls weren't in the slightest interested in me or in John, but in each other. And so John and I looked at each other, raised our eyes to the skies and got on with it together, because we actually knew these girls were not interested in men of any kind. It was a very amusing evening, never mentioned since, apart from John and I, who knew that we weren't to say anything for 2 reasons. One, any kind of homosexuality was completely illegal at the time, but likewise also any gay sex under the age of 21 was really banned, and that changed, I think, in 1967 that came in. And John was, of course, slightly older than me, so basically I think he was 22 or 23 at that point, and I was 20. But it just amused me that those were the happy days gone by. We used to shrug our shoulders and say, well, the law is an ass when it comes to the 2 ages of consent of the different genders being different, which I have to admit I and everybody else at the time felt was ludicrous. I mean, why was a girl of 16 able to decide who she loved and a boy of 16 not able, in fact, not able to decide at any point in their lives, because homosexuality was illegal, a crime between people of any age. You ended up in prison, or more likely, as in the fabulous film Victim, dead. Anyway, there we go, just a little amusing story about my time as a pop star in the 1960s, because I've had several requests from people saying, could I talk less about coronavirus, BAB, boring as Brexit, and more about my time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when I was a music star, a pop star, and a very successful record executive. See you tomorrow for day 18 of Geriatric 1944's Coronavirus Diaries.